He had everything the world told him he should want: wealth, status, a future lined with power and control, but inside, Ethan felt like an empty shell. His mansion was pristine, his suits tailored, his smile sharp and practiced, but behind it all was a man drowning in silence. He lived in a house that echoed too loudly, where every footstep seemed to carry judgment, every glance from his peers weighed against some invisible standard. He wasn't just born into privilege, he was raised by it, shaped by it, trapped by it. His father had built a legacy, and Ethan was expected to carry it forward like a torch, never dropping it, never wavering, never showing weakness. But the truth was, Ethan didn't know who he was when no one was watching. He wore confidence like armor, charm like camouflage, and fear like a second skin he could never remove. Daniel moved through that world like a shadow, quiet, steady, always there. He had been working for the family since he was 17, first as a general helper, then as Ethan's personal attendant. He knew how to fold Ethan's shirts just the way he liked them, how to pour his wine without making a sound, how to disappear when needed and appear exactly when not. He never asked questions, never made demands. He simply existed in service, unnoticed by most, but never truly invisible to Ethan. There was something about Daniel, his calmness, his quiet strength, that unsettled Ethan in ways he couldn't explain. It wasn't just that Daniel was handsome, though he was, in a subtle, unassuming way. It was more than that. It was the way he looked at Ethan, not with admiration, not with fear, not with desire, but with understanding. As if he saw past the mask, past the performance, straight into the hollow space beneath. Ethan hated that look, or maybe he feared it. Either way, he tried to avoid it whenever possible. But Daniel was always around, always present, always watching in that quiet, knowing way. One night, after a particularly brutal argument with his fiancée, Claire, Ethan came home drunk and angry. She had accused him of being emotionally distant, of treating her like an accessory rather than a partner. And maybe she was right. Maybe he didn't love her the way she deserved. But he had played the role so long, he didn't know how to stop anymore. So instead of facing the truth, he lashed out, first at her, then at himself, then at whoever was closest. That night, it was Daniel. He stood in the hallway outside Ethan's bedroom, waiting with a glass of water and a towel. Ethan barely remembered what he said, only that it was cruel, that it cut deep, that it left Daniel standing there in silence while Ethan stormed off. No apology. No regret. Just the usual cycle of pain and escape. But something shifted that night. Because for the first time, Ethan noticed the way Daniel reacted, or rather, didn't react. He didn't flinch, didn't argue, didn't leave. He simply took the blow, absorbed it, and remained. Like he always did. And that bothered Ethan more than anything else. Why did Daniel stay? Why did he never fight back? Why did he seem to understand things Ethan couldn't even admit to himself? The next morning, Ethan avoided him. He buried himself in work, in meetings, in distractions. But every time he looked up, he found Daniel nearby, silent, steady, watching. And slowly, something began to crack inside Ethan. Not anger. Not shame. Something deeper. Something unfamiliar. A question he hadn't dared ask before: what if I'm not who I think I am? The silence between them grew heavier in the days after the outburst. It wasn't loud, it didn't need to be. It settled into every room Ethan walked through, followed him like a shadow he couldn't shake. He avoided Daniel as much as possible, but no matter where he went, there was always that quiet presence lingering nearby, steady, patient, waiting. It made Ethan uneasy in ways he couldn't explain. Not because Daniel was angry or resentful, but because he wasn't. There was no bitterness in his eyes, no judgment in his voice when he spoke. Just understanding. And that terrified Ethan more than anger ever could. One rainy evening, Ethan came home exhausted, not physically, but emotionally drained. The world outside had turned gray, the sky heavy with clouds that poured endlessly onto the streets below. His day had been filled with meetings, negotiations, and hollow conversations with people who only cared about what he could give them. He felt used, empty, like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. When he stepped inside the house, soaked and shivering, he expected to find it empty. But Daniel was there, waiting by the staircase with a towel and a glass of water, just like always. Ethan wanted to ignore him, to retreat into his room and pretend the world didn't exist. But something stopped him, maybe the way Daniel looked at him, or maybe the exhaustion finally breaking through his walls. Either way, he didn't walk away. Instead, he slumped into one of the chairs in the sitting room, letting out a long breath. Daniel said nothing at first. He simply placed the towel across Ethan's shoulders and set the glass of water on the table beside him. Then, without being asked, he sat down across from him. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the rain tapping softly against the windows, and the occasional creak of the old house settling around them. Finally, Daniel broke the silence, not with accusation, not with pity, but with honesty. "You don't have to carry everything alone," he said quietly. Ethan scoffed, rubbing his face with the towel. "Easy for you to say." Daniel tilted his head slightly. "Why?" "Because I'm not rich. Because I don't live in this house like it's some kind of prison." Ethan stiffened. That was too close to the truth. He wanted to snap back, to shut Daniel out again, but something in his tone held him still. It wasn't mocking. It wasn't disrespectful. It was concern. Genuine concern. And that threw him off balance. "I don't know how to do anything else," Ethan admitted, almost to himself. "Everything I've ever done has been for someone else. My father, my reputation, Claire," he trailed off, shaking his head. "I don't even know who I am anymore." Daniel leaned forward slightly. "Then maybe it's time you found out." Ethan looked at him then, really looked. For the first time in years, he saw something other than expectation in someone's eyes. No pressure. No demands. Just space. Room to breathe. Room to feel. And it scared him. Later that night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the conversation over and over. Why did Daniel care? Why did he keep showing up, even after being treated like nothing more than a servant? Was it loyalty? Was it kindness? Or was it something else? He got up and wandered downstairs, needing air, needing distraction. He found Daniel in the kitchen, making tea. Again, there was no surprise, no hesitation. Daniel simply handed him a cup without a word. Ethan took it, sitting at the small table near the window. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving behind a quiet hush over the city. They talked again, longer this time. About books, about music, about places they'd never been but always dreamed of. They laughed. They argued playfully. And for a moment, Ethan forgot who he was supposed to be. He forgot the weight of expectation, the mask of control, the fear of being seen for who he really was. With Daniel, he felt safe. And that was dangerous. But danger didn't come from Daniel. It came from the whispers of the staff the next morning, voices hushed but unmistakable. "Too loyal, if you ask me. Doesn't he know his place? You can see it in the way he looks at him." Ethan heard them and pretended not to. He buried the words deep, locked them away like all the rest. But that night, as he stared at Daniel from across the room, something stirred inside him, something warm, something terrifying. And for the first time, he wasn't sure if he wanted to run from it or reach for it. The world Ethan thought he knew shattered one cold morning when Claire walked out of his life with nothing more than a letter and a final glance that said everything she wouldn't speak aloud. He had come downstairs expecting her to be there, sitting at the dining table with her coffee, flipping through the newspaper like every other day. Instead, all that remained was the envelope on his plate, sealed with the elegance of someone who had already made peace with leaving. He opened it slowly, fingers trembling without him realizing why. The words were precise, almost cruel in their clarity. She was done. Done with pretending. Done with waiting. Done with loving someone who couldn't love himself enough to give anything real back. And then came the part that hit hardest. "You never really loved me, Ethan. Maybe you wanted to. Maybe you tried. But you were always afraid of something deeper. And I'm tired of being the safe version of what you could have." He read it twice. Then a third time. As if repetition might soften the blow or change the meaning. But it didn't. It only confirmed what he had known all along. He wasn't built for love. Not the kind that mattered. Not the kind that lasted. He stormed through the house, anger bubbling beneath his skin like lava ready to erupt. His father would hear about this. Their families would talk. The media would find out soon enough. His perfect image, the one he had spent years crafting, was unraveling before his eyes. And worst of all, he felt nothing but shame. Shame for failing, shame for not caring as much as he should, shame for knowing deep down that maybe she was right. Daniel found him in the study hours later, staring into a glass of whiskey that hadn't touched his lips. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't need to. One look at Ethan's face told him everything. "I don't want to talk about it," Ethan snapped before Daniel could even open his mouth. But Daniel didn't leave. He simply stepped inside, closed the door behind him, and stood there, silent, steady, present. Ethan hated that. He hated how Daniel always seemed to know when to stay, when to go, when to speak, when to listen. He hated how easily Daniel slipped past his defenses, how effortlessly he saw through the mask Ethan wore like armor. "You're going to drink yourself into oblivion again," Daniel finally said, voice calm, almost gentle. "And then tomorrow, you'll pretend none of this ever happened." Ethan turned sharply, eyes blazing. "Who do you think you are?" Daniel didn't flinch. "Someone who's watched you run from yourself for years." That did it. Something inside Ethan snapped. He pushed himself up from the chair, knocking the glass onto the floor where it shattered into sharp, glittering pieces. "You don't know me," he growled. "You don't know what I've had to sacrifice, what I've had to become just to survive in this world." Daniel took a step forward. "I know you better than anyone else does. That's the problem." Ethan lunged, grabbing Daniel by the collar, shoving him back against the wall. His breath was ragged, his hands shaking with something he couldn't name. "You don't get to judge me," he hissed. "You don't get to stand there like you understand me." Daniel didn't fight back. He didn't try to pull away. He just looked at Ethan, straight into his eyes, and said the words that broke him completely: "You don't hate me. You hate yourself." Ethan released him so suddenly it looked like he'd been burned. He stumbled back, breathing hard, chest rising and falling like he'd just surfaced from drowning. The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel adjusted his shirt, still watching him carefully. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out. And Ethan let him. For days after, Ethan disappeared. He stopped answering calls, ignored messages, locked himself away in his room like a wounded animal. He barely ate, hardly slept. All he could hear were Daniel's words echoing in his mind, over and over like a broken record. "You don't hate me. You hate yourself." He didn't want to believe it. He wanted to blame Claire. Blame his father. Blame the world. But the truth was louder than any excuse he could make. One night, he finally emerged from his self-imposed exile, desperate for something, anything, to fill the hollow space inside him. He wandered downstairs expecting to find Daniel somewhere nearby, quietly waiting as always. But the house was empty. No sign of him. No note. No explanation. Panic rose in his chest like a tidal wave. He checked the guest rooms, the kitchen, the garden. Nothing. When he asked the staff, they hesitated before answering. "He left," one of them finally said. "Said he couldn't watch you destroy yourself anymore." Ethan froze. The words hit harder than he expected. Like a punch to the gut. Like losing something he hadn't realized he needed until it was gone. He stood alone in the hallway, staring at the spot where Daniel usually waited, feeling something unfamiliar crack wide open inside him. Loneliness. Not the kind that came from being alone in a room. The kind that came from being alone in your own skin. And for the first time in his life, Ethan realized he didn't know how to fix it. Ethan didn't sleep that night. He sat alone in the study where Daniel had last spoken to him, staring at the empty space across from him like the man might walk back in at any moment. But he didn't. No knock on the door. No quiet footsteps. Just silence, heavy, suffocating, final. And with every passing hour, the weight of it grew heavier. He had spent his entire life running, from expectations, from emotions, from himself. Running was easy. It was familiar. But this time, there was nowhere left to go. The walls of the house felt tighter than ever, pressing in around him like they were made of guilt and regret. He needed answers. He needed Daniel. The next morning, he began asking questions. Where did he go? Why did he leave? Did he say anything else before he disappeared? The staff avoided his gaze, speaking only in fragments, unsure whether they were allowed to talk about him anymore. But one name kept coming up, a small town far from the city, a place no one seemed to know much about but all agreed was where Daniel had come from before he came here. Ethan packed a bag without thinking twice. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. He didn't need permission. For once, he wasn't chasing an image or trying to impress someone. He was chasing something real, something he hadn't even realized he was capable of losing. The journey took hours. The city faded behind him, replaced by open roads, rolling hills, and eventually, a quiet little town that looked like it had been frozen in time. He walked through the streets slowly, absorbing everything, the worn wooden signs, the narrow alleys, the way people greeted each other like they actually knew one another. It was nothing like the world he lived in, where everyone wore masks and smiled just enough not to be rude. Eventually, someone recognized the name. An older woman who ran a small bakery remembered Daniel. Quiet boy, always polite, never stayed long. She gave Ethan directions to an old apartment above a now closed bookstore, saying that was where Daniel used to live before he moved away. The building was modest, tucked between two larger shops that had long since shut down. Ethan climbed the stairs carefully, heart pounding with every step. When he reached the top, he found the door slightly ajar, as if no one had bothered to lock it on their way out. Inside, the air smelled faintly of dust and old paper. The room was small but clean. Neatly arranged books lined the shelves, a few pieces of furniture stood untouched, and a single window let in a sliver of light that stretched across the floor like a memory. Ethan moved through the space slowly, touching things without really meaning to: the edge of a desk, the spine of a novel, the worn fabric of a chair. Then he saw it, a letter resting on the bedside table, folded neatly, addressed to him. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it. "I know you're afraid. I know you think loving someone like me would make you weak. But I've watched you long enough to see the truth. You're already breaking, Ethan. And if you keep running from yourself, you'll lose everything. Even me." The words hit harder than he expected. They weren't angry. They weren't desperate. They were honest. And that was worse than any accusation. He sank onto the bed, letting the letter fall into his lap. His chest tightened. His throat burned. And for the first time in years, maybe ever, he allowed himself to cry. Not for Claire, not for his reputation, not for the life he thought he wanted. He cried for the man who had seen him more clearly than anyone else ever had. The man who had stayed by his side when no one else would. The man he had pushed away without realizing how much he needed him. When he finally pulled himself together, he asked more questions. People in the town spoke highly of Daniel: kind, gentle, misunderstood. He had grown up poor, raised by a single mother who passed away years ago. With nothing left, he came to work for Ethan's family, finding stability in servitude. But those closest to him said he never truly belonged in that world. He was too honest, too soft, too real for a life built on appearances. Ethan listened to every word, piecing together the life Daniel had lived before becoming just another shadow in his house. And with every detail, he understood more clearly what he had thrown away. By the time he returned to the city, he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't go back to pretending. He couldn't keep hiding behind wealth, behind power, behind lies. If he wanted Daniel back, he would have to face himself first. And for the first time, he was ready to try. Ethan found him working at a small cafe on the edge of town. Sleeves rolled up, hair slightly longer than before, eyes still carrying that quiet strength Ethan had always tried to ignore. He stood outside for a long moment, watching through the glass as Daniel moved between tables with practiced ease, smiling politely, listening carefully. There was something different about him now, not colder, not hardened, but more sure of himself. More grounded. When he finally stepped inside, Daniel looked up. Their eyes met. Time seemed to stretch, thin and fragile, like a breath held too long. For a second, neither of them moved. Then Daniel set down the tray in his hands and walked around the counter, stopping just short of where Ethan stood. "I didn't think I'd see you again," Daniel said quietly. Ethan swallowed hard. "I didn't think I'd come back." There was no anger in Daniel's face, no bitterness in his voice, only caution. He studied Ethan like someone trying to decide if they could trust what they were seeing. And maybe he couldn't. Not yet. "Come on," Daniel said after a pause, nodding toward the back. "Let's talk." They sat at a small table tucked away behind stacks of boxes and empty coffee bags. The space smelled like roasted beans and old wood, and for a while, neither of them spoke. Ethan stared at his hands folded on the table, unsure where to begin. "I came looking for you," he said finally. "Not because I needed someone to take care of me. Not because I wanted things to go back to how they were." He looked up then, meeting Daniel's gaze directly. "I came because I realized I don't know how to do this without you." Daniel exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. You hurt me, Ethan. The words landed like a stone in water, heavy, rippling outward. Ethan nodded. I know. You treated me like I was nothing. Like I didn't matter unless I was serving you. I know, Ethan repeated, voice barely above a whisper. Daniel studied him for a long time before speaking again. Then why are you here? Ethan hesitated. He had rehearsed so many versions of this moment in his head, explanations, apologies, promises. But none of them felt right now. So instead, he told the truth. Because I'm tired of pretending, he said. Tired of living like I have to be someone I'm not just to make other people comfortable. Tired of pushing people away before they can get close enough to really see me. Daniel tilted his head slightly. And what do you want now? Ethan let out a slow breath. I want to learn how to be honest. With you. With myself. I want to stop running from everything that scares me. Daniel didn't respond right away. He looked at Ethan like he was weighing something deep inside himself, deciding whether to open the door again or leave it shut for good. Finally, he said, I can't go back to being your servant. Ethan shook his head. I don't want that either. Then what? Daniel asked. I don't know, Ethan admitted. But I want to try. Not as master and servant. Not as strangers. As two people who care about each other. Daniel's expression softened slightly, though the wariness remained. That's not enough. I know, Ethan said again. But it's a start. They left the cafe together that evening, walking side by side through the quiet streets. They didn't hold hands. Didn't lean into each other. Just walked, slowly, carefully, like two people learning how to move forward without tripping over the past. Back at Ethan's house, or rather, the house they would now share, the silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was thoughtful, reflective. They cooked dinner together, talked late into the night, shared stories neither had ever told anyone else. Ethan learned about Daniel's childhood, the way he used to hide his books under the bed so his mother wouldn't catch him reading during chores, the way he taught himself to cook by watching old videos online when there was no one else to teach him. Daniel, in turn, listened as Ethan spoke about his father, about the pressure to be perfect, about the fear of disappointing him, about the loneliness that came with growing up surrounded by people who only cared about what he could give them. It wasn't easy. There were moments when Ethan slipped back into old habits, withdrawing when things got too emotional, deflecting with sarcasm when he didn't know how to respond. But Daniel didn't let him disappear. He called him out gently when he tried to retreat. He reminded him that honesty meant showing up even when it was hard. One night, after a particularly difficult conversation, Ethan woke up in the middle of the night, heart pounding. He sat up, breathing heavily, realizing he had been dreaming, not of Claire, not of his father, not of failure, but of Daniel. Of holding his hand, of kissing him, of waking up next to him every morning. He stayed awake long after, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand what it meant. Was this fear, excitement, or something deeper? He didn't have the answers yet. But for the first time, he wasn't afraid to ask the questions. Days turned into weeks. Slowly, the tension between them eased. Not because everything was suddenly perfect, but because they both kept showing up. Kept talking. Kept trying. And then, one evening, as they sat on the couch watching an old movie neither of them was really paying attention to, Daniel reached out and placed his hand on Ethan's knee. It was small, simple, but it changed everything. Ethan looked at him, heart hammering in his chest. What are we doing? He whispered. Daniel smiled faintly, figuring it out. And for once, Ethan didn't pull away. At first, it was small things. A hand brushed against another when they walked through the house, a lingering glance across the room, a quiet laugh shared when no one else was listening. They didn't rush into anything. Didn't force anything to be more than what it was. But slowly, the walls Ethan had built around himself began to crack. And for once, he didn't try to rebuild them. They started going out together, not in secret, not hiding in the shadows like something to be ashamed of. Just two people walking side by side, holding hands when they wanted to, leaning into each other when they needed comfort. At first, Ethan felt exposed, vulnerable in a way that made his chest tighten every time someone looked at them for too long. But Daniel never flinched, never pulled away. He held Ethan's hand just as tightly whether they were alone or surrounded by strangers. And eventually, Ethan stopped caring who was watching. He introduced Daniel to friends, some of whom surprised him by accepting them without hesitation, others who made excuses and faded from their lives. He told his closest business partners, not because he owed them an explanation, but because he refused to hide anymore. He even called his father, not expecting approval, not needing it, but wanting to say the words out loud, "I'm in love with him." His father didn't yell. That would have been easier. Instead, there was silence, long and heavy, filled with disappointment that didn't need to be spoken aloud. Then a quiet, "I raised you better than this." Ethan hung up without saying goodbye. That night, he sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, feeling the weight of everything he had lost and everything he had gained. Daniel came in quietly, sitting beside him, not saying anything at first. Just being there. Just existing in the space Ethan needed him to fill. "I don't regret it," Ethan said after a while. His voice was steady, but his hands trembled slightly. "I don't. I wish it didn't feel like I lost part of myself along the way." Daniel placed a hand over his. "You didn't lose yourself," he said gently. "You found the real version of you. The one that doesn't have to pretend anymore." Ethan turned to look at him then, eyes searching, almost uncertain. "What if I mess this up?" Daniel smiled faintly. "Then we'll fix it. Together." The next few months were full of both struggle and beauty. There were protests outside Ethan's office building one morning, signs reading, "Love is love," standing opposite ones that said, "Traditional values matter." People left cruel comments online, sent hate mail, made assumptions about who Ethan was based solely on who he loved. Some clients pulled out of contracts. A few old friends stopped returning calls. But there were also moments that took Ethan's breath away. One evening, at a charity event he had agreed to speak at before any of this had happened, he stood on stage, looking out at the crowd gathered in the grand hall. He had prepared a speech about business, about progress, about success. But halfway through, he paused, setting aside his notes. Instead, he spoke from his heart. "I used to think love was something you earned," he said, voice calm but firm. "Something you had to prove yourself worthy of. I thought if I worked hard enough, became successful enough, followed all the rules, I'd finally deserve happiness. But I was wrong." He glanced at Daniel, who stood near the back of the room, watching him with quiet pride. "Love isn't about fitting into boxes," Ethan continued. "It's not about meeting expectations or following traditions that don't belong to you. Love is about finding someone who helps you become the person you were meant to be. And for me, that person is right there." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some people clapped. Others exchanged uneasy glances. But Ethan didn't care. For the first time, he wasn't speaking to impress anyone. He was speaking to be seen. Afterward, people approached him, some to thank him, others to question him, a few to criticize. But Ethan met each of them with the same quiet confidence he had learned from Daniel. He didn't argue, didn't apologize, just listened, spoke when needed, walked away when it was time. As they left the event together, Daniel reached for his hand. "You did good," he said softly. Ethan squeezed his fingers. "I just told the truth. That's more than most people ever do." They faced challenges, difficult conversations with family, painful arguments with people who couldn't understand why Ethan wouldn't go back to pretending. But they also experienced moments of pure joy, lazy mornings spent wrapped in blankets, spontaneous road trips, late-night talks that stretched into the early hours of the morning. Once, while walking through a park during a rare snowfall, Ethan suddenly stopped and turned to Daniel. "Do you remember the first time I yelled at you for folding my socks wrong?" Daniel laughed. "How could I forget? You nearly fired me." Ethan shook his head, smiling. "I was such an idiot." Daniel leaned in and kissed him lightly. "But you changed. That's what matters." They kept moving forward, not perfectly, not always easily, but together. Ethan started a foundation to support LGBTQ+ youth, offering mentorship and resources to young people who had nowhere else to turn. Daniel opened a small bookstore, filled with stories of love, struggle, and hope. They hosted dinners, gatherings, film nights where friends came over and talked late into the night. And every night, they fell asleep in each other's arms. There were still hard days. Moments of doubt. Times when the world outside reminded them how different they were from what society expected. But in those moments, they held onto each other tighter. Because they had chosen this life. Not out of convenience. Not out of obligation, but because they loved each other, honestly, openly, unapologetically. And nothing could take that away. Time moved differently now, not fast, not slow, but steady, like a heartbeat that had finally found its rhythm. The chaos of the early days faded into something softer, something quieter. There were still challenges, of course, moments when the world reminded them they were different, when strangers stared a little too long, when old wounds flared unexpectedly. But those moments no longer defined them. They simply passed through, like clouds across a clear sky, and then there was light again. Ethan and Daniel moved into a new home, smaller than the mansion Ethan had grown up in, cozier than the cold, polished spaces he used to inhabit. It had wooden floors that creaked underfoot, windows that let in golden morning light, and bookshelves stacked with stories from every corner of the world. There were mismatched mugs in the kitchen, soft blankets draped over the couch, and plants scattered around the living room, some thriving, others barely surviving, but all loved anyway. They built a life together not out of obligation, but out of choice, small choices made every day, shaping the kind of future they wanted. Mornings began with coffee brewed slowly, shared at the kitchen table while reading the news or laughing over something silly one of them had said in their sleep. Evenings ended with movies watched side by side, sometimes with subtitles, sometimes without, depending on how tired they were after work. Ethan's foundation grew steadily, gaining recognition for its support of LGBTQ+ youth. He spent more time mentoring young people who had been cast aside, offering them guidance, resources, and most importantly, a space where they could be themselves without fear. He didn't do it for praise, though it came anyway, but because he knew what it felt like to grow up believing you had to hide who you were to survive. Daniel's bookstore became a haven for people who loved stories, not just the ones written in books, but the ones lived between two people who chose each other every single day. He hosted poetry nights, queer author readings, and community gatherings where people talked about love, identity, and everything in between. Sometimes, Ethan would stop by after work just to sit in the back corner, watching Daniel interact with customers, his smile warm and genuine, his voice calm and welcoming. They weren't perfect. No relationship was. There were disagreements, sometimes about big things, sometimes about nothing at all. One night, they argued about music, of all things, Ethan preferring the quiet hum of classical melodies, Daniel insisting on the raw energy of indie rock. Another evening, they sat in silence for nearly an hour after a conversation about family, about the ones they had lost, the ones they had chosen, and the ones who never quite understood them. But even in those moments, they stayed. They listened. They held onto each other, even when words failed. One rainy afternoon, Ethan found Daniel curled up on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, reading a worn copy of a book he had read dozens of times before. He looked peaceful, content in a way Ethan had once thought impossible for himself. So he joined him, settling beside him without a word, resting his head against Daniel's shoulder. "I was thinking," Daniel murmured, turning a page. "We should host a dinner soon. Invite some friends over." Ethan smiled slightly. "You mean our friends?" Daniel chuckled. "The ones who actually like us." "Yeah, them." So they did. They cooked together, Daniel handling most of the seasoning while Ethan tried not to burn anything. They set the table with mismatched plates and candles that flickered warmly in the dimming light. Friends arrived, some longtime, some newer, all smiling, all welcome. They laughed. They ate. They talked late into the night, passing around wine glasses and sharing stories that made everyone either tear up or burst into laughter. At one point, someone asked how they had gotten to this place, how they had built something so real, so strong, so full of love. Ethan looked at Daniel, who simply shrugged and said, "We just kept choosing each other." And that was the truth of it. There were no grand declarations, no dramatic moments of fate bringing them together. Just small, steady choices, to listen when it was hard, to stay when it would have been easier to leave, to love when the world told them not to. Later that night, after the guests had gone and the house was quiet again, Ethan stood at the window, looking out at the city beyond. Daniel came up behind him, wrapping his arms around Ethan's waist, resting his chin on his shoulder. "You okay?" he asked softly. Ethan nodded, placing a hand over Daniel's. "Just thinking." "About what?" He smiled gently. "About how lucky I am." Daniel kissed his cheek. "Me too." They stood like that for a long time, wrapped in each other, surrounded by the life they had built, finally at peace. Years passed, but the rhythm of their life never changed, not in the way that mattered. They still woke up tangled in each other's arms, still shared coffee at the kitchen table before the world had fully woken up, still held hands when they walked through the city like they had nothing to hide. Time moved forward, but their love remained steady, quiet, deep, unshakable. Ethan's foundation continued to grow, helping young people find their voices, offering them shelter, guidance, and hope. He no longer gave speeches for approval. He gave them because he knew what it felt like to be alone, to feel broken, to believe you didn't deserve happiness. And now, he wanted every person who walked through his doors to know one simple truth: you are not alone. Daniel's bookstore became more than just a place to buy books. It was a gathering space, a safe haven, a home for those who needed somewhere to belong. He hosted readings, discussions, community nights where people came not just to talk about stories, but to live them. And every time someone walked through the door, he greeted them with the same quiet kindness that had once pulled Ethan from the darkness. They traveled when they could, long road trips through countryside towns, weekend getaways by the sea, spontaneous flights to places neither had seen before. They took photos, wrote postcards, laughed at each other's terrible sense of direction. But no matter where they went, they always came back to the same place: their home, their life, each other. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in soft hues of orange and pink, they stood on the beach, barefoot in the sand, watching the waves roll in. Ethan reached for Daniel's hand, holding it tightly as if to remind himself that this was real, that this life, this love, had been built from pain, from fear, from moments when everything almost fell apart. Daniel leaned into him slightly, resting his head on Ethan's shoulder. "Do you ever think about how different things could have turned out?" he asked quietly. Ethan nodded. "All the time." Daniel looked up at him then, searching his face. "And do you regret any of it?" Ethan smiled, slow, genuine, full of meaning. "Not a single moment. Because even the hardest parts had led them here, to this life, to each other, to something real. The betrayals, the heartbreaks, the years spent pretending to be someone they weren't, they had all been steps toward finding the truth." Voiceover gently began as the scene faded into a soft montage, glimpses of birthdays, holidays, quiet mornings, laughter-filled dinners, walks through autumn leaves, snow-covered streets, warm summer nights. Sometimes, love finds us in the most unexpected places. Sometimes, it wears the face of someone we thought was just passing through. But sometimes, they were meant to stay. The screen faded to black. Text appeared slowly, accompanied by soft music. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment below. Tell us about a moment when love surprised you. Then, the channel logo appeared with "Subscribe for more heartfelt stories." Bell, don't forget to hit the bell. And just like that, the story ended, not with fireworks or grand gestures, but with love, lived quietly and honestly, from start to finish. We left Kyoto under a sky painted in soft hues of pink and gold, the last rays of sunlight stretching across the horizon like fingers reaching for something just out of reach. The train ride back to Tokyo was quiet, not silent, but filled with the kind of peaceful stillness that only comes after a storm has passed. Kato sat beside me, his head resting against the window, eyes closed. His breathing was steady, deep, he looked almost peaceful, almost asleep. I watched him for a moment, letting my gaze trace the curve of his jaw, the faint shadow of stubble forming along his chin, the way his dark hair caught the fading light and reflected it back like ink mixed with gold. He looked different now, not just because of what had happened between us, though that had changed everything, but because he seemed lighter. Like whatever weight he had been carrying before this trip had finally started to lift. And maybe I looked different too. Because I felt different, like I had spent years walking through life with blinders on, always focused on the finish line, never realizing that sometimes, the real journey wasn't about winning, it was about who you chose to walk beside. The train slowed as we approached the station, and Kato stirred beside me, blinking open his eyes slowly. He turned his head slightly, catching me watching him. "What?" he asked, lips curling into a small smile. I shook my head. "Nothing." He raised an eyebrow. "You were staring." I shrugged. "So?" He chuckled softly, shifting in his seat. "You okay?" I nodded. "Yeah." He studied me for a second longer, then reached out and took my hand. I let him. His fingers laced through mine easily, like they had done it 100 times before. And maybe they would. Maybe they already had. As we stepped off the train and into the bustling station, the noise of the city swallowed us whole, announcements over the loudspeaker, footsteps echoing against the tiled floor, the distant hum of traffic beyond the glass walls. It felt like stepping back into reality. Back into the world where people knew our names, where expectations waited for us, where judgment lurked behind every glance. But this time, I didn't feel afraid. Because I wasn't alone. We walked side by side through the crowd, our hands still connected, shoulders occasionally brushing. No one said anything. Some people glanced at us, some didn't even notice. And that was okay, because we didn't need their approval. We had each other. By the time we reached the university dorms, the sky had darkened completely. Streetlights flickered on one by one, casting long shadows across the pavement. We stopped outside my building, standing beneath the glow of a single lamp. The air was cool, crisp with the promise of autumn, and the scent of fallen leaves lingered in the breeze. Kato turned to face me fully, letting go of my hand only so he could cup my face gently between his palms. I leaned into his touch without thinking. "You sure about this?" he asked quietly. I blinked up at him. "About what?" He smiled faintly. "About us. About everything." I swallowed hard. "No." He chuckled softly. "Me neither." I let out a breath, shaking my head slightly. "This is insane, you know." "I know," he agreed. "But it's also good." I stared at him for a long moment, searching his face for any sign of doubt, any hesitation. But there was none. Just warmth. Just certainty. Just him. I reached up, placing my hands over his, holding them in place against my cheeks. "Okay." He tilted his head slightly. "Okay." I nodded. "Okay." He smiled then, really smiled, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. We stood there for a while longer, just breathing in the same space, wrapped in the quiet understanding that neither of us needed words to say what mattered most. Eventually, he leaned forward and pressed a soft kiss to my forehead. "See you tomorrow," he murmured. I nodded again. "Yeah." He pulled away slowly, giving me one last look before turning and walking down the path toward his own dorm. I stayed where I was, watching him go, until he disappeared into the night. Then I turned and headed inside, heart full, mind racing, soul lighter than it had ever been. If you've made it this far, thank you. Thank you for listening to this story, to these characters, to these emotions, to this journey from rivalry to love. If something in this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt the tension of unspoken feelings, if you've ever struggled to admit how you truly feel, or if you've ever found love in the most unexpected places, then I hope this story gave you something. A little hope, a little comfort, maybe even a little courage. Because love, real love, doesn't always follow the rules. It doesn't always make sense. But when it's right, when it's true, it changes everything. If you enjoyed this emotional journey, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more stories like this one. Your support means the world, and it helps me continue creating content that speaks to hearts like yours. Also, don't forget to drop your thoughts in the comments, whether you loved it, hated it, or just want to talk about your own experiences. I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, take care of yourself. And remember, sometimes, the person you least expect is the one who ends up changing your life forever.